Greetings and welcome to this review of The Darkness on Diamondia by A. Van Vogt. Now, our man A.E., who is apparently known as Van around the traps in California, I believe, when he was writing, was a fairly influential part of the science fiction scene. He was born in 1912. So remembering that is well over 100 years ago. He started writing early. I did a correspondence course and started writing for profit. He wrote the True Confessions, where someone, normally a woman, writes in and talks about all the terrible, terrible things that she's done in order to titillate, I guess we'd say, the readers. However, he moved on to science fiction in 1938. It was a genre he liked reading and he started writing it. A Darkness in Diamondia was, if I understand it correctly, first published in the 70s, the early 70s. And Van Vogt and his wife were out of the science fiction community for a while, though he never entirely stopped publishing. He largely wasn't writing while he was managing the local Dianetics chapter for Hubbard. He moved back into science fiction and away from that side of his life when Dianetics became Scientology. He didn't approve of the mysticism part of it. He was into the more practical, how to make a person a better person sort of thing, as I understand it, as far as I know. All of these things are relevant to this book, very. In the dedication of this book, he dedicates it to Fred Pohl, who, for better or worse, in 1964, when he was editor of Galaxy, Worlds of If, and Worlds of Tomorrow, persuaded me to write science fiction again. And this was first published about 10 years after that. Okay, let's talk about my copy. My copy is a rather nice New English library. I get a lot of those here, and look at that cover. It is spectacular. I absolutely love this cover. And when I first saw it, I was willing to put in a good bet that it was a Tim White cover. Of course, I checked that first on ISFDB so that I wouldn't seem a fool in front of you. But yeah, look at those beautifully blended background colours that are all of a single palette. Then you've got that exceptional detail nearby. Tim White did some of the most amazing field type detail, and while my camera can't quite focus on it, some of that detail, the plants, the grasses, the flowers are perfect. You can even identify wild oat among there. Moving on. Then you've got that really interesting science fiction-y structure in the middle ground with a slightly different colour palette, but borrowing from both of the other ones, and that is almost certainly meant to be a reflection of the rather interesting buildings described on Diamondia. What is this book about? Well, there's the back, and I could read it to you. However, having read it to myself when I was about a quarter of the way in, I realised that the back suffers from some key misunderstandings about what's in the book, as if whoever wrote it had not actually read the book, just had someone describe parts of it, and had their own takeaway message, which they never got corrected. What I would say the book is about is, well, we start with Colonel Morton. Colonel Morton is a member of the Federation Intelligence Unit, and he's been sent to Diamondia as part of a negotiation committee team because there is some kind of war going on. We are often told there is a war going on. We don't actually see much of this war. It's just a word that gets thrown around. But anyway, Colonel Morton and his second-in-command, Lieutenant Bray, are there on Diamondia to negotiate with about this unrest. Now, the initial chapters are really pretty cool. Colonel Morton is driving along. Lieutenant Bray is with him. Lieutenant Bray writes stories. He writes stories. He sends them back to Earth where they get published. And he doesn't write anything about what he's actually doing because, as he said, who'd believe that? But he does write in the settings of where he is, like Diamondia. I feel like this is a little bit of Van Vogt making a pun about his life and his community and writing for profit. Now, Diamondia is a really cool planet, and I love what Van Vogt does with the planet building here. It was settled by humans who brought every type of wildlife with them they could imagine. Leopards, pheasants, songbirds, whatever. It's like all the wildlife seems to be Earth. I assume they brought rats and cane toads as well, because humans do that. That's very human. But despite the ecology, there were natives living there when Diamondians arrived. They are called Irsk. I'm going to pronounce it Irsk. And the negotiation team Morton is attached to is primarily to keep everyone busy while the Federation does its own thing. What the Federation plans to do is take all the fighting men of the Federation off the planet, leaving the Diamondians, that is the humans that have from living in Diamondia, to themselves. It is anticipated that when that happens, the Irsk rebels will then slaughter all the Diamondians. Of course, there's a counter movement of Diamondians who want to make sure the Federation stay. The Irsk revolutionaries seem odd in that while the species, the people aren't well explored, it seems that most of them are very pleasant, mild-mannered, sensible people who don't really take exception to anything. Irsk are being used as servants by humans on planet because of course they are. I think it's estimated there's about 700,000 humans who will all get slaughtered if the Federation withdraws. But the Federation is going to withdraw, and Morton is there basically to keep everyone occupied and chatting until they get around to it. So you've got at least this many factors. You've got the Federation, you've got the Federation soldiers who actually don't want to withdraw, allegedly. They on the Diamondian sides. Then you've got the Diamondians who are against being airlifted. I assume there are some Diamondians that don't mind. We don't hear from them. There's their Irsk who are team human. There are Irsk who are team anti-human. There's a lot. There's a lot. And none of it is really incredibly well evolved or gone into. Van Vogt obviously had things that he wanted to convey to his reader, but the things that I would mainly think would be interesting, not so much. So the Irsk, as aliens go, were fascinating, and I loved them. Whilst, as I said, not terribly well described, their buildings apparently are. It sounds like they're organic, almost grown, with all of them beautiful, with these arches and these special features. They just sound gorgeous. And the Irsk themselves are definitely my cup of tea. They are amorphous. They're described as having round, bland faces with large, round, calm eyes. But once you visualize that, you have to move back a step and start visualizing the rest. They apparently don't have an internal skeleton. Exactly how they move isn't terribly well described. There's one point where Van Vogt describes reaching out with one tentacle, and yes, he does call them tentacles, and then stiffening it as though it had a skeleton that you could move with a paced gait. How does it do that? So my prime hypothesis would be a hydrostatic skeleton, like you would see in, I don't know, the tongue, for example. And in a lot of invertebrates, you've got this hydrostatic hydrocele that moves. Without a skeleton, how does that work? We've got our skeleton on the inside and the muscles attached to it, and by tensing the muscle, things move. Insects do it the other way around. They've got the exoskeleton, the muscles are inside, and by tensing their muscle, it relaxes. Their relaxed state is actually contracted, the opposite to us, if I remember correctly from zoology. Then you've got the really exciting invertebrates like the cephalopods that have no skeleton at all. The only calcification an octopus has, how am I talking about octopus, is the brain case and the beak, but all the rest of it is essentially invertebrate. Now, how does it move? Well, it's got two sets of muscles and they work antagonistically to each other, flexing and contracting. So that's how the octopus gets its range of movement. And from the totally insufficient amount of description I get from Darkness on Diamondia, that's how I imagine the Irsk moving. They sound really good. There's an element of culture. We hear that before humans arrived, they didn't eat. They got nutrition in some other way. But once humans arrived, they became suddenly addicted to pizza, hamburgers, and chips. And why wouldn't you be if high cholesterol wasn't a problem? So you've got all this set up, all of which I really enjoyed. But this book does go off the rails a fair bit in a few different ways. So for the first 80 to 100 pages of this, 188 page book, the plot seems to mainly move forward by Morton being kidnapped by one group after another, and hence us learning what those groups are. He is unconscious a lot of the time whilst being kidnapped from one group to another. And after one final unconsciousness, we move from Morton to Lieutenant Bray, who it's then his turn to be kidnapped by one group or another and regularly to be unconscious. And so our progression of understanding the plot, the different peoples, their different motivations, is very punctuated in a lot of ways. So, and at some point, about halfway through, I started to get a little bit meh about the whole thing. So the socio-political setup is good, the world building is good, the plot, while erratic, is interesting enough. Whatever it is, I'm still not quite entirely sure if the plot you think you're getting is the same plot that A. Van Vogt thought he was giving you. Probably not. The Iranian houses sounded amazing. All of it's good. What was I not really vibing with? Well, while I am not oversensitive in my reading of older books about sexist stuff, Van Vogt's got some oddities in this one. And when I was looking for it online, I thought it's really weird that almost no one has reviewed or mentions having read this book. It's maybe not that weird. It's maybe people are just being cautious, because in this book, all women are prostitutes, which is problematic. The way he talks about prostitution is even more problematic in a way that I find it very ineffable. It's hard to put my finger on. Now we hear about the rest of the Federation. The rest of the Federation has a women's union to which most women belong, and which apparently prohibits women from having sex whenever they like with guys, or from guys from interacting with the women unless they're engaged to them. It is decidedly creepy. I'm saying Ayn Rand level creepy. And while you don't go into it too much, he goes into it regularly throughout the book. We keep hearing about this. One of the important things about Diamondia to the Federation is that the women's union didn't how does he put it? Did not win many converts. So it's a religion-y thing on Diamondia. So most women are still not in the union. So that means that men can exercise their masculinity with the hundreds of thousands of prostitutes that seem to be teeming through the pages of this book. So all of that's a little bit tricky, but it's not primary for the first part, so I can ignore it. Then we have one particular woman, Isolian, her name is. She is a member of the Diamondia resistance who don't want the Federation officers to leave because she doesn't want to be slaughtered and everyone else with her. Her father is apparently a colonel in the Diamondia army who is currently fighting against the Irsk in some weird valley. And I've got to say, this valley of Quail or Quaig or whatever it is kept cropping up, and I was getting serious vibes from Terry Pratchett's Thud. Anyhow, Isolia tells Colonel Morton that she is a prostitute, which, you know, not really, that she sleeps with a dozen men a month, and how terrible she is because of this. And she's doing it because she wants to gain traction for the revolution, and that seems to be the only way she can do it. Okay, fine. Morton's response to this is ineffable. I really don't know what Van Vogt was trying. I think Van Vogt was trying to prove to us how open-minded Colonel Morton is to not care that she actually has sex with whoever she wants. Maybe that's what we're going for. Anyhow, written by a man who was born 110 years ago. You've got to have some open-mindedness about that. But the key concepts of his sexual dynamics, his gender dynamics, in this, are wobbly at best and crashing to the ground at worst. Okay, what else do we have in Diamondia that is weird? So, Van Vogt is described generally as a golden age author, I believe. Yes, he is. Golden age of science fiction, emerged in the 60s and 70s, blah, blah, blah. Some people who know more about this stuff, whose work I've read, are fairly emphatic that a lot of his work is more suited to fitting into the new wave which came afterwards. I would argue that this book is pure new wave, and if you like the new wave, non-traditional, inner space, emotions, neuroses, social commentary part of the new wave, then you will like Darkness on Diamondia. And don't forget that no matter how much I criticize this book, I actually did enjoy it overall. It's got issues, no doubt, but I liked it despite that. I'm glad I read it. It is good. I'm definitely holding on to it. I may read it again in a few years. Think new wave. Think Philip K. Dick. If you love Philip K. Dick, you will probably find a lot to like in The Darkness on Diamondia. You'll just have to wince and twitch your way through the Women's League and all that really odd stuff. Moving on to the inner exploration, the emotions, the one true man, every man sort of thing that we've got here. Remember me saying that Van Vogt was a member of Dianetics, and he ran the Centre for Hubbard for a number of years. Now, when Dianetics started, it didn't have alien mythology and all the other weird stuff that Scientology apparently does today. What it did have was a series of exercises and explorations in order to get a person to be the best version of themselves, cast off the problems that were holding them back, all that sort of stuff. And I know that because my parents tried it, and I found a whole heap of textbooks in an old box one day of Dianetics. It was a bit bizarre. Didn't know that. I'm pretty sure that a lot of that Dianetics attitude towards being your best person is very heavily influential in Morton and his behavior and the belief systems that Van Vogt is trying to present us with. So the social behaviors and theories of this federation seem a bit like a brotherhood of the 700 civil servants on Diamondia. Of course, not a single one of them is a woman. Still, that wouldn't normally smart, but it does on this case. And I think that in order to understand some of what Van Vogt is getting here, you really do need to understand a little bit of some of the concepts that Dianetics was promoting. For example, I made a note here somewhere about, oh yes, Morton talks about how he is ascending to becoming a finite logic being through his training by the Federation. And he also talks about women accosting him in the street because he is becoming a finite logic male, and their logic in their femaleness relates to his finite logic. So God, bloody might. Anyway. So a lot of these concepts and theories within it are odd. I didn't get them, but quite often I didn't get them. Occasionally I did. So that's why it feels very new wave. As we progress into the book, some of the writing gets odder and more erratic, and some of that is Dianetics. I think at some point, probably Van Vogt got a little bit bored with the whole thing, because it doesn't progress in a normal, traditional, rational sequence of events. If you've got a war, you would expect to see some warlike activity. If you've got all these different factions, you'd expect to see something of them. But because our vision of this world is almost entirely through Morton and Bray being kidnapped by multiple people at multiple times and going unconscious, a lot of it we don't. Until, by going unconscious, Morton discovers that he has topped into the mind of an Irsk. I keep wanting to say Irish. It isn't spelt like that though. Irsk, a native species. He's wandering around doing his business, but through hopping into his brain, he finds out there's actually a weapon that the rebels want to get. And they later finds out that this is called Mind Brother. He also then expands his mind from the Man Brother into this huge darkness, the darkness in the title, that is hovering over this world and is allowing the Irsk to communicate non-verbally and telepathically with each other. And then it gets weird. It gets really weird. You're going to have to want the weird for this one. And I do think that lots of people will enjoy the weird. So Morton has apparently gained control over this darkness and the mind melding and the swapping around telepathically. But before him, the person who was in charge of it wasn't one of the Irsk. It was this guy called Marriott, who's a member of the Federation forces and somehow involved in the war. Though despite Van Vogt talking about it a lot, I never did quite figure out how. So you've got Morton going unconscious left, right and centre, and then he somehow sends a signal to all these other dozens of people to tell them that they are in fact Colonel Morton, and they believe that. Not sure what the purpose of that was, but it ends up with the Irsk being very confused about who Colonel Morton is, because lots of people are claiming to be. Why he wants to do that, I'm also not entirely sure. There's a lot. I have to admit that for about, I don't know, a quarter here, I was a little bit bored. I was over it. My chores got done well because I didn't really want to pick up the book whenever I put it down. It was just annoying, but I bowled on through it, and by the end I was thoroughly engaged again. I liked the ending, whatever it was. I really can't tell you for sure. I think it was a happy ending. Isolde dies. Someone dies. But I think it's still a happy ending in some manner, because all of humanity hasn't been wiped out, or at least not all of humanity on Diamondia hasn't been wiped out, with the possibility of the rest of humanity later, which might be what this shadow mind was aiming for, possibly, though we don't not sure. I'm going to leave you with a couple of thoughts. In chapter 28, this is in the part where I feel that Van Vogt was a little bit bored with what he was doing and couldn't quite see his way through to what was going to happen. Everyone's converging on this valley, and we start with Isolina woke up on a plane and experienced the proprioceptive sensations of flying. Hang on a second. I want to know what proprioceptive is. It refers to the sensory information from your body's muscles, joints and tendons. It gives you an awareness of your body's position, movement and force in space. You could have just said she knew she was on a plane. Why did you make me Google the word, Van Vogt? Proprioceptive. Okay. Anyhow, after she's proprioceptive for a while, she realised that Marriott has knocked her out for reasons that are never entirely clear, but it gets her to the valley. And there's, having told us it was Isolina in the first paragraph, a bit later, Van Vogt writes, by this time the woman was experiencing warning signals in her body, an unusual lassitude, weakness, a strong need to go to the bathroom. How long have I been out? She demanded. This is the part of the writing that I didn't really get all that enthusiastic with. I won't go any more into... Oh, yes, I will. I wasn't going to go any more into some of the more obnoxious genderisms, but I will go into this one. So, page 51 was the first time that had me reaching for the sick bucket when he writes, knowing that a woman's desire is for true love. He has to be sorry for Isolina because she's had sex with so many men that obviously she can't have true love. Born over 100 years ago. I keep telling myself. Ah, yes. Then in chapter 37, when everyone's converged on the valley and there might be some fighting happening somewhere, not that we see very much of it, all of a sudden Van Vogt goes into this fascinating fugue where he's talking about all the wildlife, the points of view of all the wildlife in the Guayama ravine, which is where all this is happening. So we've got this bizarre night-flying snipe are departing. The next group of pigeons, however, couldn't leave till dawn. The silver and Kalige pheasants, strong runners, went away. The two leopards stirred. And we just have this zoological expedition through all the animals that humanity have brought to Diamondia that are currently residing in the valley and are getting upset by the shots that different groups may or may not be firing at each other, at the hypnotic drug that is whooshing off into the caverns, leaving weird side effects. I don't know. This all has the plot, whatever it is, ends up being about this darkness hovering over Diamondia, which is allowing people to mind hop between each other. It's being kept under control partly by Captain Marriott and being the elected king of it or something, and his machinery, which is warfare, and also by an Irsk Locitine weapon, which is apparently somehow meant to keep the darkness under control as well. And I've got no idea, really. This would be an excellent, most perfect buddy read for two people who really want to sit down and nut out what things may or may not have meant, what people may or may not have said, and what on earth it was all about. I still don't know, but I really did enjoy trying to find out. So that was A. Van Vogt's The Darkness on Diamondia. A. Van Vogt, you never know what you're going to get with him. You really don't. But this is, well, it will never eclipse Slan in my affections. It's a pretty good one. It's far better than Children of the Atom or whatever. So, yeah, certainly worth reading if you're into new age weirdness and classic science fiction. Thank you very much for watching. Read good books. Yes, A. Van Vogt.